In today's video, I'm going to debunk a long-standing myth about Queen Jane Seymour and her role in reconciling Henry VIII with his daughter, Lady Mary. While Jane has been credited with reuniting father and daughter, the truth is much more complex, and Jane just wasn't the key player in this story. Let's dive into what really happened. Now, Henry VIII and his 20-year-old daughter Mary, the future Mary I, were reconciled in 1536, following the king's marriage to Jane Seymour, and Mary was welcomed back to court. But I just want to correct a myth. That reconciliation had absolutely nothing to do with Jane. Now, I'm not saying that Jane wasn't sympathetic to Mary's plight. She was. Mary had been banished from court and made to join the household of her half-sister Elizabeth, made illegitimate and demoted from princess to lady, denied access to her mother Catherine of Aragon even in Catherine's dying days, and bullied by members of her father's council, all because of her father's great matter, his wish to annul his first marriage and marry Anne Boleyn. Like her mother, Mary had refused to accept that her parents' marriage was invalid and her father's position as supreme head of the church in England. Henry VIII was furious with his first wife and daughter and treated them appallingly. Mary appears to have blamed Anne Boleyn for everything. And just 7 days after Anne's execution, Mary wrote to Thomas Cromwell, asking him to intercede with her father on her behalf, assuming that their relationship could be easily mended now that her wicked stepmother was out of the way. There's no doubt that Anne did encourage Mary's ill treatment, but it was the king who was responsible for it, and Mary found that out when her treatment actually got worse, and she received a disturbing visit on the 15th of June 1536 from members of the king's council, one of whom, as recorded by the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who heard it from Mary, told her that, were she his or any other man's daughter, he would beat her to death or strike her head against the wall until he made it as soft as a boiled apple. In short, that she was a traitress and would be punished as such. That must have been so intimidating. It must have been a huge shock too, as Mary had been given hope by Chapuis and the Catholic conservatives at court that everything would change after Anne was brought down, because Jane was sympathetic. And she was. I'm not denying that. And I'm also not saying that she did nothing to help Mary. She did make some effort. Chapuis, on the day of Anne's execution, wrote to the emperor saying, "I hear, nevertheless, from many authentic quarters that even before the arrest of the concubine, and when speaking to Mistress Jane Seymour about their future marriage, the lady proposed to him to replace the princess in her former position. And on the king telling her that she must be out of her senses to think of such a thing, and that she ought to study the welfare and exaltation of her own children, if she had any by him, instead of looking out for the good of others, the said Jane Seymour replied that in soliciting the princess's reinstatement, she thought she was asking for the good, the repose and tranquillity of himself, of the children they themselves might have, and of the kingdom in general, inasmuch as should the reinstatement not take place, neither your majesty nor the English people would be satisfied, and the ruin and desolation of the country would inevitably ensue." And following the marriage, Chapuis wrote that it was said that she was continually trying to persuade the king to restore the princess to his favour. 19th century historian Martin Hume, in his book The Wives of Henry VIII and the Parts They Played in History, writes of Jane trying once more to reconcile Mary and Henry. He recounts a conversation between the two of them in spring 1537 when Jane was pregnant. Hume writes, Jane was sad one day in the early period of her pregnancy. "Why, darling," said the king, "how happeneth it you are not merrier?" "It hath pleased your grace," replied the queen, "to make me your wife, and there are none but my inferiors with whom to make merry, withal your grace excepted, unless it would please you that we might enjoy the company of the Lady Mary at court. I could be merry with her." "We will have her here, darling, if that will make thee merry," said the king. And before many days had gone, Mary, with a full train of ladies, was brought from Hunsdon, magnificently dressed, to Whitehall, where in the great presence chamber Henry and his wife stood before the fire. The poor girl was almost overcome at the tenderness of her reception, and fell upon her knees before her father and his wife. Henry, as usual anxious to throw upon others the responsibility of his ill treatment of his daughter, turned to his counsellors who stood around and said, "Some of you were desirous that I should put this duel to death." "That were a pity," quoth the queen, "to have lost your chiefest jewel of England." The hint was too much for Mary, who changed colour and fell into a swoon, greatly to her father's concern. Hume does not cite a primary source for that story, and I feel it is a story. I'm afraid it's just not accurate. Mary had already submitted to her father. She did that on the 22nd of June 1536, and then she was reconciled with him, with Jane and Henry visiting her on the 6th of July 1536 and staying with her for a few days. During that time, Jane gave her stepdaughter a diamond ring, and the king gave her 1,000 crowns. So Mary was reconciled with Henry VIII months before the spring of 1537. Jane may have been sympathetic to Mary. She may have tried speaking up for her before her marriage to the king, but I doubt she pushed it after the marriage. She'd been put in her place the first time she talked about Mary, being told to worry about herself and her future children instead. If the man I was marrying, the same man who was allowing his second wife to be executed, said that to me, I'd shut up about it, wouldn't you? The person who was responsible for the reconciliation of Mary and her father, the king, was Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador and a man who was a true friend to Catherine of Aragon and Mary during those years of suffering. Following that awful visit of members of the king's council and their bullying, Chapuis, who was worried about Mary's health and her safety too, persuaded her to submit to her father. He wrote to the emperor that he told Mary that in order to save her own life, on which the tranquillity of this kingdom and the reform of the many great disorders and abuses by which it is troubled entirely depended, it was necessary that she should make all manner of sacrifices. He also told her that was the emperor's advice and wish. Mary then went ahead and signed a letter of submission to her father without even reading it, but that afterwards she fell suddenly into a state of despondency and sorrow. Chapuis comforted her by explaining that the Pope would not hold it against her and that he would highly approve of it under the circumstances. It must have been so hard for Mary. It was going against everything she believed, and she must have felt that she was betraying her mother and God. So, Chapuis was responsible for Mary being reconciled with Henry VIII, and that reconciliation only happened after Mary did everything that her father wanted her to do, not because anyone made Henry change his mind or be more sympathetic to his daughter's plight. Historian Gareth Russell pointed out that Mary may have been received back at court with open arms by the King and Jane, but only after Mary had done everything Anne Boleyn had wanted Mary to do so badly, and that Mary had actually been offered a better deal by Anne Boleyn. Anne had offered her far more than a diamond ring. She'd offered Mary the chance of a better status. In 1534, Anne had told Mary that if she visited her and honoured her as queen, she would be as well received as she could wish, and that it would be the means of her regaining the good pleasure and favour of the king, her father, and of her being treated as well or perhaps better than she had ever been. Mary declined. Anne tried again after Catherine of Aragon's death in early 1536, writing to Mary and telling her that if she would lay aside her obstinacy and obey her father, she would be the best friend to her in the world and be like another mother, and would obtain for her anything she could ask, and that if she wished to come to court, she would be exempted from holding the tail of her gown. Mary still declined. It took more bullying from her father and Chapuis's intervention to finally get her to submit. I hate that Anne Boleyn played a part in that young woman's ill treatment, something that led to Mary being, as Chapuis recorded, so eager to escape from all her troubles and dangers that if he were to advise her to cross the Channel in a sieve, she would do it. And I'm so very glad that Chapuis was there for her and able to help her. But what about Jane Seymour and Elizabeth? What was their relationship like, you may ask? Well, Jane really didn't have anything to do with Elizabeth, who was 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was executed. Henry rather neglected his youngest daughter during his marriage to Jane, and Jane didn't attempt to rectify that as far as we know. However, as historian Elizabeth Norton points out, Mary did take active interest in her little half-sister and wrote to their father saying that Elizabeth was such a child toward as I doubt not but your highness shall have cause to rejoice of in time coming. It's so lovely that Mary didn't harbour any hard feelings to the little girl whose household she'd been forced to join and recognise as princess after her own demotion. Going back to Jane, I really can't blame her for keeping her own counsel, can you? Much better to not get involved in politics and subjects that might upset your rather volatile husband. To conclude, while Jane Seymour may have been sympathetic to Mary's situation, the reconciliation between Henry VIII and his daughter had nothing to do with her. The real hero in restoring Mary to her father's favour was Eustace Chapuis, who carefully orchestrated her submission. If you've enjoyed this video and want more Tudor history content, do make sure to like, share and subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on my next video. I'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye bye.